Hello, everyone, and welcome back for another episode of the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast. The Outdoor Adventure Series celebrates individuals and families, businesses, and organizations that seek out and promote exploration, stewardship, conservation, access, and enjoyment of the outdoors. Our guest today is Ed Arnett. Ed has been a wildlife biologist, a researcher, conservationist, and educator for more than 30 years. He's also worked in conservation policy and communications in the last decade. These days, when he's got some time on his hands, he is also the CEO at the Wildlife Society. And I had the pleasure of meeting Ed this past May, seems like so long ago, at the annual conference of the Outdoor Writers Association of America. And I loved kind of listening to Ed, hearing his point of view, and I thought this guy is going to be a perfect guest on the podcast. So, Ed, thank you for joining us on the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast.
Great to see you again, Howard, and real pleasure to be on.
Fantastic. Now, first of all, I want to get obviously into the Wildlife Society, but I'd love if you could, a 30,000-foot view or so, is to provide our listeners with a little background about your work and how you got into wildlife biology research, because this is really, you kind of look back and we often can see the breadcrumbs. Sometimes we see those breadcrumbs stopped and another set of breadcrumbs started a little farther along. So tell us a little bit about your story.
Sure. And it all kind of began when I was a kid. My grandfather took me hunting and fishing, as most grandfathers do, or many do. I just had a strong love for animals. And I think you and I are both of the age. We remember that show called Wild Kingdom, hosted by Marlon Perkins and Fowler and others. And that had an enormous influence on me. I watched that religiously every time it came on. And it just guarded my love for wildlife. And I didn't know what to call what those folks were doing, but I said, I want to do that. And as I entered into high school, it started to develop in my mind. I never deviated. I never said I wanted to be a fireman or a veterinarian or anything else as a kid. It's like, I want to do what Marlon Perkins and mainly Jim Fowler. Marlon did all the narrating and sat in the truck and the boat, as we all know, while Jim and others did the hard work. But that's what really got it going. And then just that love of the outdoors, spending time outside with my grandfather and on my own as well, hunting and fishing and just growing that love for nature. So I right away left high school and went right into college seeking degrees in natural resources management, wildlife management, and went through doctorate work, master's and doctorate work, and got into the wildlife research side of things. But that's how I kind of garnered the desire, and I've never looked back. I've always wanted to be a biologist, now that I know what to call it, and have always been so in different kinds of arenas, I guess I'll call it, or sectors of the profession. Done some management work, research work, conservation work with NGOs, and policy work as well. So got a lot of breadth in my resume, and I've loved every minute of it.
I love it. It's, as I jokingly like to say, we've been on a lot of different rodeos, so it sounds like that for you. I love to circle back, if we could, and unpack a couple of the items that you shared. First, I'm always amazed when my guest shares how they first got started, and the fact that your grandfather took you out and it introduced you to the outdoors and the activities, whether it be hunting, fishing, could have been hiking for that matter, biking.
Sure.
And I had the pleasure and the fortune of my dad taking me out. My grandfather was a little older and he had his issues, but it's funny, his side of the family, they owned a fish market. And I thought that would have been cool. At least I would have been closer to the fishing and the angling. Right. But so you spent some time out there. By the way, where did you grow up?
I grew up in South Central Illinois in a small farming community. We weren't on a farm per se, but I worked on a farm my whole life, and in some way, shape, or form throughout all the way to high school, and knew all the local farmers, and so just that classic small Midwestern town kind of community, and We were fortunate because we could just walk out the backyard almost literally, and you were right there in nature. And we knew my grandfather was a gas truck driver. He drove for Standard Oil and delivered fuel to all these farmers, so we knew them all. So it was very easy. And back in those days, pretty easy to get permission just by knocking on the door. But you can still do that a little bit today. But it was really easy when I said, "Hey, I'm the grandson of your fuel deliverer." So easy to find places to go recreate and have fun and enjoy the outdoors.
That's great. And I'm envious as well because I never had that. And with just I kind of see that thread over and over again as I have chat with the guests. Now, where did you go to school to get your degrees?
So it's a long story, and I will not bore your audience as to why all the reasons behind it. But I jumped right to Colorado to a small school on the West Slope called Colorado Mountain College.
Okay.
I started researching where to go to school, and I knew I didn't want to do it in Illinois. I wanted to go out west. I'll be back up just a little bit. When my grandfather retired from that job, he and grandma they did what classic retirees did at that time. They bought a new truck and a fifth wheel trailer, and they went off and they traveled the West and the Northwest. They went all over the place, and then they snowbirded down in Texas. So I got to go with them for about 3 months after school was out in the summer of '73, and we went to Yellowstone. We went, no, the summer of '75, and we went to Yellowstone. We hit a bunch of national parks, but we did spend 1 month in Colorado, and I loved it.
Mhm.
And my grandmother's cousin lived in Rifle, and I found this little school in Glenwood, which is really close. And I thought, well, if I'm going to move so far away from home, at least I've got a family member reasonably close. I saw him maybe twice in 2 years. Once I
Right.
got out there, it was game on, and I was just doing things all the time. But that was a 2-year degree. Then I went to Montana State University, got a bachelor's degree there, wound up doing my master's at the University of Wyoming, worked on bighorn sheep and habitat relationships. Took a hiatus and worked for 10 or 11 years, and then went back and finished my doctorate as an older student back in Oregon State.
Okay. Well, you've hit the big states. I mean, Illinois, Colorado, Montana, Wyoming, Oregon. I'm like, that's pretty good. I used to write papers when I was in elementary school about Colorado, and I know one day I'm going to end up back there. I don't know where,
Yeah.
but I'll end up in Colorado, which is not a bad thing because Nevada with the water, who knows?
Yep.
So,
Nevada's a nice state, though.
oh
There's,
yeah,
there's
oh,
great places.
I
I
mean,
like Nevada.
if you can think of Nevada outside of the casinos and
Right.
downtown, it is beautiful.
It's amazing. The
It's yeah,
sagebrush ecosystem is a stunning landscape and ecosystem. Unfortunately, the drought and fires have altered it quite a bit. But yeah, no, if you, like you say, if you can get out of Reno and the Vegas area, it's absolutely amazing out in
most
the
de-
ecosystems.
definitely. Now, as you began to cultivate and really maybe it's clarify your interest in what you were passionate about, was it more on the biology side, the research, the public policy? How did you begin to kind of hone where your expertise was going to go?
Yeah, back to the Marlon Perkins, Jim Fowler story. I really wanted to do the field work again.
Mm.
When you're of that age, I really didn't know what you called it, how to get into it. I was just so naive, but I knew I wanted to study animals and handle them, research their behavior and habitat patterns and all that stuff. And that's where I did start out. I was really in the field biology, field research side of things early on. Well, after I got my master's degree, my first job was, well, my very, very first job in the whole profession was as a forestry technician in 1983. And I decided I didn't want to be a forester. I still had the option of going any number of paths
Yeah.
because I just got a natural resource degree. I could have gone any number of directions, but I really wanted to follow that wildlife thread. But I did work in the forest sector for a while, and that's a good career too. But when I really dug in deep after my master's degree, I was mostly a management and a research biologist for a long while before I entered into more of the administration, I would call it, because I kind of moved up in one NGO and
Right.
was overseeing programs, so became more of an administrator than a scientist, an active practicing scientist. But then I morphed into the policy side of the
Okay.
world with another NGO, and now in my current job, I oversee the organization of called the Wildlife Society, which is the professional society of wildlife professionals. So I oversee a little bit of everything,
Sure.
policy administration, our journals, and all kinds of
Mhm.
things.
Now, the Wildlife Society, and it's interesting that you and I are having this conversation. Is I had the CEO of the Isaac Walton League on. Uh, they're celebrating 100 years.
Yeah, sure. 100 years.
Outdoor Writers Association of America is going to be celebrating its 100-year anniversary in a couple years. You guys have been around 75 years ish. That
Yeah, a little bit longer. We were founded in 1937,
Okay,
and that was in the era of Aldo Leopold.
right.
Most listeners, if not all, should know who Aldo Leopold is. If you don't, write that down.
Okay, so I'm going to stop you for a second. Let's make an assumption. I don't know who Aldo Leopold is, and I've heard the name is familiar to me, but why should we care and need to know who he is?
Aldo Leopold I don't want to go through his whole life history, but ultimately he became a forester. It was in the era of predator decimation, where the only good wolf was a dead wolf. But he was quite a bit of he was quite a visionary, and he always often reflected in one of his essays, one of his most famous essays, about shooting a wolf and walking up to it and seeing the last green fire in its eyes. And it was his aha moment. I know this is an important part of your podcast. That was his aha moment where he realized that predators were a critically important part of ecosystems to manage overpopulated deer herds. And he was starting to put the pieces of the biological community and ecosystems together. Godfather of modern day wildlife management. He was the first professor of wildlife management at the University of Wisconsin. He wrote the very first book on game management, and he wrote a great book that is his most famous. He has other essays, but this is the most famous. It's called the Sand County Almanac. And if your listeners haven't read that book, I would strongly recommend it. I teach a course at Colorado State University solely on Leopold and his legacy, and the Sand County Almanac is good for anyone of all ages, all backgrounds, all disciplines, anything. It doesn't matter. It's just poetic vision of humans and the connection with nature and why nature is so important to us. It's a beautiful book and very inspirational. So Leopold actually was certainly in the founder mix of the Wildlife Society, being the first professor of wildlife management, and a group of Midwestern folks that were in wildlife management and such got together and formed this society.
Mhm.
It's the same time. It's exactly the same time that the National Wildlife Federation was formed as well. The idea there was the Wildlife Society would be more of the science management arm of the needs for professional societies, and the Wildlife Federation would take on more of the education and policy aspect. So we were formed at basically the same meeting, which was the first North American Conference on Natural Resources, and it's called the North American Wildlife and Natural Resources Conference. And Leopold, you'd think, would have been our first president of the Wildlife Society, but he wasn't. He was our third president.
Okay. Okay.
But we've been around a while. Our 100-year anniversary is probably well into my retirement, but we have been around a little bit.
I think it's fantastic. And maybe because I grew up in the Midwest and I was in the middle of the auto industry in Detroit, we have the Great Lakes and we have our state parks, but these organizations like the Wildlife Society, never on my radar. I mean, the closest nature was on my radar was like the Boy Scouts.
Yeah.
Okay, that was it.
A lot of us were in the Boy Scouts. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so I feel like
Scouts.
I'm learning now and playing catch up, though. I think I'm a little low for some of the catch up, but who knows? So, with in your profession, and there's public policy, there's bills being written, there's rules and regulations, but how does the role of the people who are in these organizations and the wildlife biologists, the folks that have your background, how does that work affect what's being done today out in the environment?
In the policy arena
Well,
specifically, or?
I mean, they're not. I mean, maybe you get into policy after you've been in the job for a while, but if you're a major in wildlife biologist you major in wildlife biology at school, wherever it might be, and you say,
I
this
see
is
where you're
what I
going.
want to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where are they going? What are they doing?
So, and this is changing quite a bit as the years go by, and things change as change happens. But typically, and this was my scenario where I got out of graduate school and I started as a technician working for the National Park Service, and then found a full-time position with the Forest Service, but it wasn't a full-time job. It was called a not to exceed appointment. So it was for a 1-year appointment, and then they extended it and so on and so forth. But you typically start by building your resume, doing lots of volunteer work. This is borderline a recommendation for anyone listening that wants to become a biologist. You got to pay a little bit of dues in that you work for a state wildlife agency for a summer job or a volunteer position, work with graduate students on their projects, just to build as much breadth as you possibly can. This is kind of my story. And I worked every summer in some capacity. There was a forestry technician, worked on a grizzly bear research team one summer. And then I had to focus on my master's program. If you go on to graduate school, which most biologists this day and age do, not all, but most do, you certainly can find lots of work with a bachelor's degree. There's lots of field related jobs that a lot of people are very happy just doing that. They never want to get into the bureaucracy or even do necessarily all the research side of things. But if you want to do research, you're going to have to get into a master's program or perhaps go on to a Ph.D. And if you want to get into academia and become a full professor, ultimately, if that's your goal, you definitely need to go through a Ph.D. program. I see a lot of master's folks out there that are smarter than a lot of PhDs, if not more, most of them. But it's just got a personal desire at some point where you've got that base education, you've got a good bit of experience working in the field and showing some dedication, some smarts, and passion for the resource and passion for the job, and people notice that. And then you can be a state agency wildlife biologist for the federal agencies. The nonprofit world has all kinds of positions for biologists, and in particular, nonprofits like Ducks Unlimited, Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever, Mule Deer Foundation. Those folks are hiring scientists, but they're also hiring a lot of field biologists that are coordinating other like volunteers through their chapters to do actual field work, removing bad fencing or putting in water projects, doing habitat projects. And then to further on in my case, I became chief scientist at a policy organization called the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership.
Okay.
So there's a whole wide range of positions that are out there. And of course, as you get older and more experienced, you start moving into different levels of those.
Right. When does the transition, maybe it's an abrupt one or a gradual one, of going from being out into the field to perhaps making a decision, I'd like to learn more about policy and feel like not only am I just collecting data and reporting on it, but now I can have an impact through other means of the actual policies that get written for laws and regulations?
And that's individually driven, of course. I think if you survey any early career professional, or most early career professionals or students, they'll tell you, well, I just want to work in the field. I want to keep an arm's length away from all that bureaucracy and administrative work and such. until you prove yourself, and you're dangled with the employer dangles a lot more responsibility and more money that goes with it. And there's
Right.
always an inverse relationship with money and responsibility and field time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for the longest time, I always said I live my life in thirds. I'm a third of the time in the field, a third of the time in meetings, and a third of the time traveling to do other types of coordination and those kinds of things. So it's life in thirds.
Sure.
But there, I think, for me personally, and this was a moment when I moved away from being a pure scientist to, overseeing more programs and being in more administration. I realized that I'd kind of done a lot of the field work. I garnered some accolades as a scientist, and now it was time to share the wealth, if you will, and really provide that administrative oversight and leadership for a team
Mhm.
and let them shine and give them all the support and resources they want. And that comes differently at different times in people's careers. And sometimes they never necessarily even have that moment where they feel like this is my time to give back in this way. But that hit me at a nonprofit back in the mid 2000s. And it was a nice shift. It allowed me the opportunity to still dabble in the science and the biology, but to oversee these programs and allow other people to have their fun and give them the support they needed to really shine. And then we all shined and looked good
Sure.
in that particular organization. So that's how it kind of worked for me. And then in the policy, that's a different animal altogether, because an individual really has to fully appreciate how important and critical policy is in natural resources, wildlife, and fisheries conservation first, and then they have to appreciate the role they're about to step into, whether that's a state wildlife agency lead of a wildlife or fisheries division, becoming the deputy director, or ultimately the director of a state wildlife agency. And the same thing with the federal chain. In the case of nonprofits, the higher you go, and you may get into the more of the policy side of things, but there are NGOs that specifically focus on policy. I mentioned the TRCP.
Mhm.
That's an organization that its mission was centered around policy. So, and that kind of became an aha moment for me. I don't know if this was the right time to share it or not, but the reality I had was
Perfect time.
when I stepped into that organization, I thought I knew. I'd spent some time in DC and served on a federal advisory committee at the request of a Secretary of Interior. And boy, I thought I knew something about policy. And that aha moment came for me when I realized I had only dabbled along the edges. I really did not have a full, complete appreciation like I do now after spending 10 years with the TRCP and really playing what I would call big A advocacy in
Right.
DC and at the state level with governors and with cabinet secretaries, and dabbling with the in and out of talking to advisors in the White House and CEQ and senators and their staff and congressional members and such. It's a different level. It's similar at the state level, and then you realize quickly it's all about relationships. You're not going to be a go-to person unless people know you and they respect and trust you, and
Mhm.
so then it becomes all about relationships. So another aha moment really for any biologist is that you realize one day that's not all just about the animals, and especially state biologists know this really well, and others do too. It's you're a people manager as much as anything. You have to factor in those social economic factors, public input, and this all kind of links back to the public trust doctrine and the fact that state and federal agencies are the stewards of public wildlife. And the quicker a biologist knows that, the quicker they'll appreciate the fact that, yeah, you got to be a people and public manager as well, because the public has a right to tell you there are laws written and policies in place in every state and federal agency
Mhm.
that allow the public to provide their input. And it should be taken seriously because it's the public's wildlife.
Sure. So I'm curious, it in the importance at the state level and the impact that the federal government has at maybe it's suggesting, promoting through organizations like yours and others, these are what we care about. When does it become important that it's not enough for a policy? Let's just use wolves as an example. Okay. That it's not important enough to look solely at the state level, but we have to have a more of a federal emphasis in order to truly protect this wildlife resource.
Where that really kicks in, Howard, is with migrating species and especially international migrating species. Waterfowl are a great example. They don't, no wildlife, no political boundaries or state and federal boundaries. So the federal government oversees migratory birds, for example. So that's and whether they're listed as threatened or endangered or not. It's we have a North American waterfowl management plan. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service oversees that, and that's a good example of federal oversight with strong state input in each of the flyways and at other levels, depending on whether you're talking migratory birds or waterfowl, songbirds, I meant, versus waterfowl, those kinds of things. There's always going to be that state federal interface, and always an awful lot of contentious discussions there sometimes and disagreements at times. But that's a good example, and particularly in the hunting and fishing space, of how seasons are set, bag limits are set. It's through the flyway councils and through coordination with the state. But the feds oversee more broadly migratory birds. When a species is imperiled, as the sage grouse, I'll use the sage grouse as example. I'm not too big on talking on wolves. Wolves are a fine topic to talk about, but it's awfully hot and contentious across the range now.
Yes, it is.
But when it becomes apparent that the populations have reached a level where state management, maybe perhaps no fault of theirs, federal management, just all the combined efforts to try to proactively save a species from becoming threatened or endangered is no longer working, then someone will petition to list a species, and the Fish and Wildlife Service will make a determination as to whether a species should be listed, and then it will become under federal oversight and management, again with state input, but far more federal oversight, obviously, when you bring in the Endangered Species Act. So those are a couple of examples. A species like wolves, you mentioned them, they obviously were nearly extirpated and were extirpated across a lot of the range.
Right.
But when the Endangered Species Act was signed in 1973, they were almost immediately put on the list, and have been on that list up until they had reached recovery goals. And they've been on again, off again on the list, but it's mostly been decided by the courts and the court of public opinion. So I think wolves have recovered quite nicely in most of the regions, especially Yellowstone. They've expanded from Idaho into Oregon, Washington, California. We're about to get wolves here in Colorado. That happened by ballot initiative, and but that's the court of public opinion. I don't personally like ballot box biology, as I call it. It's a little like my heart surgeon being told by the public what kind of valve they can put in my heart. I wouldn't like that.
Right.
Wildlife professionals need to hear that public input, but I'd like to leave it to the professionals to decide on some of the how-tos and whens. But bottom line, wolves are listed some places and remain unlisted in others. So that federal state oversight gets a little messy sometimes on some of these species, and quite controversial.
I can imagine. And the other question that's kind of percolating for me is there's scarce dollars, and how do we fund some of this work? And again, I think that'll also be a good segue to your organization, the Wildlife Society, because a lot of what you do is perhaps member driven and funded through memberships.
Sure.
And so how do organizations like yours shape some of the funding decisions that get made, or is that not in your in your purview?
We have a role in that, Howard. It's a little different than some, and maybe I'll back up just a little bit with a history lesson here. I mean,
Okay.
one of the amazing things about North America, and particularly the United States and Canada, and the U.S. very specifically, is how we fund our conservation. Roosevelt and others were, and even before them, were before those folks in Aldo Leopold's time and others. Everybody had the right mindset on conservation when they were seeing habitats being depleted, thus populations being depleted at exponential rates, and they knew to preserve things. But the next generation started trying to figure out, well, how do we fund this? And we have things like the Duck Stamp Act, which required waterfowl hunters to buy a waterfowl stamp, and a very significant proportion of that, it's not quite 100%, but it's darn close, of that money goes into wetland conservation. That was established, and I should know the date, back in the 30s, I believe. But then you have the Pittman-Robertson Act. Duck Stamp Act might have come sooner. I should know this. I teach this stuff.
Hey, look, it's Friday. It's Friday.
But that provided millions and millions of dollars and has conserved, tens of millions of acres of wetland habitat. And I always tell my students, if you want to do one thing, you don't have to buy a hunting license necessarily, but buy a duck stamp. Duck stamps are designated for refuges, expansion purchases, those kinds of things, and enhancing wetlands. And you can do a lot of wildlife, a lot of good just by buying that duck stamp. Hunting and fishing licenses, of course, which were not a thing until the turn of the century, that funds conservation. But also the Pittman-Robertson Act, which is an 11% excise tax on ammunition and firearms, similar for bows and arrows, and then the Dingell-Johnson Act for fishing equipment. That generates immense amounts of money and helps fund particularly the state wildlife agency programs. And then there are other ways that conservation gets funded. Our taxpayer dollars go into appropriations. Congress appropriates money to federal agencies, and they in turn do conservation and management of wildlife. And there's any number of ways that the NGOs operate. The way my organization operates, we're funded in a variety of ways. We get revenues from our membership fees, of course, but we get revenues from our publications, our annual conference and sponsorships, donations, those kinds of things. But how we affect funding is we actually work on the policy side to make sure that the federal agencies are getting the resources they need. State agencies are getting funding through various appropriations that they're entitled to, distribution of PR funds. Anything policy related to funding is kind of where our space would be, and ensuring that we have conservation funding available. And it raises the question about who's paying for it. There's no question sportsmen and women pay a significant chunk of that through license fees, through the PR dollars, and that's all generated a portion of a recreation-based economy that a lot of people don't even appreciate. They don't think it's a real thing. That maybe it's just a bunch of people, working at the ski area or kayaking for a living or whatever they think, fishing and guiding. The outdoor recreation economy is a behemoth and a force to be reckoned with, and nearing $1 trillion and multi-millions of jobs. So hunting and fishing contribute to that. But the question becomes, who all is going to pay in the future for conservation? And not everybody pays an equal share, that's for sure.
Right. Very interesting. And I see the arguments back and forth locally, state, federal. It's going to be constant. It's going to, like everything else that's out in the public space, everything is more polarized and louder at the same time.
Right. Well, just to put a bow on this one, the conservation funding aspect here in the U.S. it's unique in a large degree because of this public resource, and we have the opportunity. You and I can just go buy a license over the counter in the state of Colorado and go fishing, or we could go elk hunting in certain places. And you just can't do that most places in the world. And
Right.
associated with that, we spend money on hotels and gas and everything else. So it's a vibrant part of the economy. It's an important part of the economy in other parts of the world, but it's just different. It's just a
Right.
little bit different than what we see here in the U.S.
How does an organization like the Wildlife Society market itself as a leader in policy and conservation stewardship? How do they market themselves? Because, like I said, I mean, you've been around nearly 100 years. I wish I had learned about you back when I was in my teens and 20s.
Yeah.
It's never too late. But organizations like yours are important. So how do you grow and bring in new members, keep the thought processes fresh, and continue to thrive?
Now, clearly, we have some work to do with the public. Not a lot of people I talk to don't know who the Wildlife Society is, and that's not a ding on my predecessors or other
Mhm.
council members of yore, but we've got some work to do on that front because I think it's critically important that people know what wildlife biologists do. I mean, wildlife and fish population don't just manifest out there on the landscape magically, and they don't necessarily take care of themselves magically as they did maybe 150, 300 years ago or earlier. We are a part of this ecosystem and we have huge, huge impacts. We could go down that thread any number of directions, but the bottom
Mhm.
line is wildlife need to be managed in many situations, and they also provide recreational opportunities and all these things. And we need wildlife professionals in our current day to provide these resources for all members of the public. And most people
Right.
don't appreciate that and understand what wildlife biologists do, which is why I'm so glad we're having this conversation. Let alone they don't know what the Wildlife Society is. I mean, we are the professional society, but our mission is to inspire and empower and enable those professionals through training, workshops. We hold an annual conference, we publish journals, and then we provide what we call member services and services to wildlife through our policy and our communication shop and such. So that's kind of our role. And my one of my goals is to get our brand and our name out there more. I don't expect the interesting thing, and I didn't even know this until I joined, that there aren't any criteria necessarily to join the Wildlife Society, except you do have to check a box when you pay your dues that say you will abide by our code of ethics. And our code of ethics are pretty extensive and specific to the wildlife professional, but you could join tomorrow if you wanted to. One of the things I'd like to do is actually establish, and I have to talk to my counsel about this, but I'd like to establish a way for more communicators to be working with us and be members, but maybe not necessarily full members as wildlife
Right.
people, but as wildlife communicators, something
Mhm.
that need to do down the road. But we do need to get our name out there more broadly. I think all of the federal agencies, state agencies, that nonprofits, they all know who we are. Most biologists know who we are, whether they're members or not, but the public doesn't. And I think it's important
Right.
that they know that there is a professional society out there dedicated to its professionals. But,
Sure.
the in terms of bringing on the next generation, not everybody appreciates what our society does, and that's partly my job and my staff's job and our council's job to let biologists and professionals know that it's important to support your professional society. So we need to demonstrate what our value is to our members, but I can assure them what their value is to us. It's strength in numbers. It's broadening our membership to where we have breadth and expertise and diversity. And I mean diversity at all angles, human diversity, ethnic diversity, different sectors of the profession, researchers, managers, people that work in industry, people that work in federal and state agencies, all across the board. So that's what it means to us, is to have that strength in numbers and that diversity so we can share all those perspectives to keep bringing in the new generations of biologists. So
Sure.
it's something we've struggled with at the Wildlife Society for a long time. We've held in that 10 to 11,000 member range, and we just need to improve our value proposition to our own professionals. But I know there's room to improve where we can get our messages out to the public better, which is why I wanted to have this conversation with you. It's why I went to
Sure.
OWWA and OWAA, sorry. And
Okay.
I'm looking to get a suite of communicators working with us to communicate
Mhm.
our science to the public. And I think our space in a lot of this, the policy and the management also, is that science credibility and background. As I said, we published 3 journals, but that's the foundation of the Wildlife Society is sound science and
Right.
using that to influence other things like policy.
Sure. Sure. One thing that dawns on me as you are sharing this is there are amongst your 10,000 members, there are lots of great stories there
Oh,
of
yes.
the field experience, the how is this experience translating into a decision that gets made or a proposal that gets written. And that's the key, I think. And
Yep.
I mean, you got a great website, you got a lot of great information, and it's a very reasonable membership fee. And so, if you care about wildlife and the work, then it's a great investment. Plus, I did notice your conference is coming up in Spokane later in the year. I'm like, oh, it's not so bad.
Yeah. This will be
So,
our first in-person conference since the pandemic. So we're very excited. Those annual conferences, it started where the Wildlife Society met at the meeting called the North American Wildlife and Natural Resources Conference. We did that until 1994, and then we broke away and developed our own conference in the fall, the North Americans in the spring. The idea there was to immerse the wildlifers and researchers, biologists with more high level administrative and political figures. At
right,
least that was how it worked for the longest periods of time. And now our meeting is more technical in nature, although we do touch base on policy and administrative type techniques and such. And some of those folks come to our meeting, but it's more of a technical meeting and an opportunity
gotcha.
for students to present their science, to train young
Okay,
students and early career professionals, and explore our own avenues and diversifying the profession. Not everybody
sure,
knows you can be a wildlife biologist. This is one of my goals. It's hard to diversify your profession if sectors of the population don't even know it's a thing. So
yeah,
I happen to know it's a thing because I watched Marley Perkins and Jim Fowler go out there and tackle wildlife and play, but not everybody does. And so one of my
yeah.
goals is to increase that educational opportunity and everybody should have an equal chance to be a biologist if they so desire. But it starts by knowing that you could even have a profession, a
You
career in
have to be
doing.
where it exists.
Yep,
Yeah,
exactly. But we're very excited about the Spokane meeting. We try to rotate those around time zones. So not all of our members, 11,000 members, and we are a global organization. We have a strong contingency in Canada. We're getting ready to open, start a chapter in Mexico, but we're looking for ways to, and many a member from around the world, but we're looking to expand that international component through partnerships into the
sure.
future. But um, our annual conferences are where we gather 1,500 to 2,000 individuals, but by rotating in everybody gets a chance to go locally because not everybody can go from Florida to Spokane. If it's in Spokane, you're liable to get Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, strong
Right.
contingencies there. If we go to Florida, we'll get the strong Southeast. You know what I mean? We move our rotator around. So we service our members across
Good.
and we go to Canada too, and hopefully to Mexico one of these days soon.
Very good. Very good. Yeah. Before we head out today and you share your social sites with us, one last segment we want to ask, and this is a feature on our Outdoor Adventure Series podcast. It's called the Insight to Go. And what we look at this segment as is an opportunity for you to share and leave something with our listeners about your work, your career, perhaps the impact that the organization is having. What would you like to share with our audience to leave them with today?
So, Howard, we talked earlier about Aldo Leopold, and I mentioned the Sand County Almanac. That's certainly some insight to go. I'll reemphasize that. Go buy a Sand County Almanac. But one of my favorite quotes from Leopold in that book stems from his vision and being a visionary about how people viewed land, how they viewed wildlife, how they viewed water, all of these things that we call an ecosystem in a biotic community. And I think it resonates with me because I feel one of the biggest threats to wildlife today is public disinterest and disconnection. People just are more isolated from wildlife than perhaps they've ever been. I mean, Richard Liu wrote a whole book about this on no, I can't remember the title, No Child Left Behind in the Woods or Last Child in the Woods, but it was about that disconnect that people are that seems to be increasing with a lot of urban and suburban areas. And one of Leopold's greatest fears, and this is the quote, was that people would believe that breakfast comes from the grocer and heat comes from the furnace. And what if you really think about what that means, it means they have no understanding of where food comes from or how heat is produced, and the whole interconnectedness of not just nature, but also our influence and impact on nature and how we generate heat. It doesn't come from the furnace. It comes from whatever, burning dead dinosaurs as coal, or it comes from solar or however. But, and obviously breakfast does not come from the grocery store. It comes from a biological entity there. So I think that was Leopold's greatest fear. It's one of my favorite quotes. And if you think about that and read that book and all the other quotes and just inspirational writings of Leopold, it's pretty solid insight to go with anyone.
Fantastic. Well, we will provide backlinks to some sites that point to Leopold's work. We'll also provide the backlink to the Sand County Almanac. I know I'm going to be buying it, by the way. A lot of the podcast turn into a purchase on Amazon or wherever you purchase your books. So thank you for that. And really, it's as I get older and I kind of look back where we're at today, and it's burning hot here in Las Vegas. It's hot today. And how do we get here? And for us to be, and part of that is that disinterest that you just shared. And not only at where we get our food from, the grocer and the heat from the furnace, if we don't truly understand how the system works, this ecosystem works, we're in deep trouble, I think. So again, thank you for that insight to go. So if our listeners would like to learn more about you and the work with the Wildlife Society, where would they go?
So our website is the classic www, but just type in wildlife.org. Or if you go to Google, just TWS even works. You can spell out the Wildlife Society. TWS comes up sometimes first in the Google search, but usually second. There's something TWS Amazon that pops up every once in a while first, but we are the Wildlife Society, wildlife.org, and you can find us on the whole suite of social media platforms as well. And we do have a YouTube channel. We're looking to expand that quite a bit and highlight our members. You mentioned earlier, boy, well, look at all the fodder and stories and material I've got. I'm looking to really expand that in the coming year, highlighting our members out in the field. And speaking of out in the field, we've got a vocalization series called Out in the Field, Wildlife Vocalizations, looking at the diversity component in our profession, whether it be people of color or under LGBTQ community. Anybody can be a biologist, and we welcome anybody, and we welcome all.
Fantastic. And by the way, we're going to have a get to know Ed Arnett little video segment, and feel free to put that on your YouTube channel as well. I mean, share it to the channel. But
we will absolutely do so, Howard.
Very good. Well, Ed, I appreciate you taking time out of your busy day and to join us. And I feel very grateful to learn more about the Wildlife Society and the impact your members and wildlife biologists are making, and whatever we can do in the Outdoor Adventure Series to help get the word out. That's what we are here to do as well. So thank you, thank your team for being here, doing what you're doing, because that's what makes a difference. So thank you.
Absolutely. Great talking to you, Howard. Look forward to doing it again someday. Thanks for what you do,
Fantastic. Well, listen,
getting the word out.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And listen, stay on the line. We're going to do a quick close, and you and I can have a final chat. Okay?
Sure.
All right, folks. We have just been chatting with Ed Arnett. He is the CEO at the Wildlife Society, and really learned a lot about Ed and really what is the life of a wildlife biologist, a researcher, conservationist, educator, and just the impact that this kind of work has, not only in understanding our very complex ecosystem, the wildlife, the waterfowl, birds, etc. The impact that the wildlife has is all around us, and organizations like the Wildlife Society are helping to steward positive changes to make sure it's here for not only my generation but generations that follow, and hopefully as a place too, as you understand what this organization does and the work that these scientists are doing, that maybe this is an area you go out and do Google searches of Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom and check out Merlin Perkins and Fowler, and just like, wow, maybe you'll be just like Ed and say, I want to do that just like them. So really great opportunity to get out and explore, and a lot of great careers out there. We really appreciate the work that Ed and the Wildlife Society are doing. If you enjoyed today's podcast, do make sure you go out to wildlife.org or the TWS. If you search for that on Google, you will hopefully find the Wildlife Society as well. And again, they are also on the major social platforms, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And we will provide all the backlinks there as well. As for us, you can find us on the Outdoor Adventure Series.com. That's our website. And we will also be on LinkedIn and Facebook on our Outdoor Adventure Series pages, as well as the major podcast platforms. So wherever you listen to your podcast, just do a search for Outdoor Adventure Series. Okay, folks, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there, have a phenomenal day, and we will see you on a future episode of the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast. Take care now.